The new maid was fixing a light until he said, "You're beautiful," and she froze in shock. Hello, let's hear another incredible story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. I love narrating stories for you, so get ready. Let's start. Imani Davenport stood in the marble foyer of the Whitmore mansion, clutching a crumpled piece of paper with her temporary employment details, and wondered if she'd accidentally walked into a museum instead of someone's home. The ceiling stretched impossibly high above her, adorned with a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than her entire year's rent in her cramped Dorchester apartment. "Okay, Imani," she whispered to herself, adjusting the collar of her crisp white uniform shirt. "You've got this. It's just cleaning. You've been cleaning your whole life. Granted, never in a place where the doorknobs look like they belong in Versailles, but still." Her internal pep talk was interrupted by the sharp click of heels against marble. Mrs. Hartford, the head housekeeper, appeared like a storm cloud in sensible shoes, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of mild disapproval. "Miss Davenport," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent managing households that functioned with military precision. "I trust you've reviewed the orientation materials I provided?" Imani nodded, though she'd barely skimmed the 17-page document about proper conduct, appropriate cleaning techniques, and something called discretionary invisibility. That sounded like a superpower she definitely didn't possess. "Excellent. Your first assignment is the second-floor library. The reading lamp near the east window requires a new bulb." Mrs. Hartford handed her a small ladder and a box containing what appeared to be the world's most expensive light bulb. "Mr. Whitmore conducts his morning calls from that room, so efficiency is paramount." As Mrs. Hartford's heels clicked away down the hall, Imani made her way up the sweeping staircase, running her fingers along the polished banister and trying not to gawk at the oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors who seemed to follow her movement with their eyes. The library was a book lover's paradise, floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, comfortable reading chairs positioned near tall windows that flooded the space with golden morning light, and the kind of silence that felt sacred. At the far end of the room, near a massive oak desk, stood the problematic lamp. Imani set up the ladder, testing its stability twice before climbing. The lamp hung at an awkward angle, requiring her to stretch precariously to reach the fixture. As she unscrewed the old bulb, she found herself humming, a habit that had gotten her in trouble at her last 3 jobs, but helped calm her nerves. "Come on, you stubborn little—" she muttered, wrestling with the bulb that seemed determined to remain in place. The ladder wobbled slightly, and she gripped the lamp fixture for balance, her heart skipping as she imagined explaining to Mrs. Hartford how she'd managed to destroy priceless antiques on her first day. That's when she heard it. A voice, low and rough around the edges, speaking from somewhere behind her. "You're beautiful." The words hit her like a physical force. Imani froze completely, her hands still wrapped around the lamp fixture, her body suddenly hyper-aware of every sensation. The slight sway of the ladder, the warmth of sunlight streaming through the window, the way her pulse had begun hammering against her throat. Beautiful. The word echoed in her mind as she tried to process what had just happened. In her 28 years, she'd been called many things: spirited, troublesome, too loud, too much. But beautiful wasn't a word that found its way to her very often, especially not delivered in a voice that sounded like aged whiskey and midnight conversations. The old bulb slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, falling to the hardwood floor below with a soft crash that sounded thunderous in the library's silence. The ladder swayed dangerously as she turned to look over her shoulder, her movement quick and unthinking. There, standing in the doorway like he'd materialized from one of the oil paintings downstairs, was a man who made her forget how to breathe properly. Tall, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her car. His eyes, grey like storm clouds, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously visible and transparent. This had to be Julian Whitmore. She'd seen his photo in the business section of the Globe enough times to recognize the sharp jawline and the way he held himself like he was perpetually posing for a magazine cover. But the photos hadn't captured the way he seemed to fill the entire doorway, or how his presence made the enormous library feel suddenly intimate. She started, then stopped, realizing she was still perched on a ladder, probably looking like a deer caught in headlights. I was just the light bulb. She gestured helplessly at the broken glass on the floor. Julian stepped into the room, moving with the kind of controlled grace that suggested he'd never in his life tripped over his own feet or knocked something over by accident. He glanced at the shattered bulb, then back up at her, and she caught something flickering across his features. Surprise, maybe, or amusement. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and there was genuine concern in his voice that made something warm unfurl in her chest. "No, just startled." She began climbing down the ladder, acutely conscious of his eyes following her movement. "I'll clean this up right away. Mr. Whitmore, I'm sorry about the mess." "Don't apologize," he said quietly. "I'm the one who... I didn't mean to startle you." When her feet touched solid ground, she turned to face him fully, and the impact of his proximity hit her again. He was even more imposing up close, but there was something in his expression, a softness around his eyes that seemed at odds with his corporate reputation. "I'm Imani," she said, extending her hand without thinking, then immediately second-guessing the gesture. Was she supposed to shake hands with her employer? Mrs. Hartford's orientation packet probably covered this. Julian looked at her outstretched hand for a moment before taking it, his fingers warm and slightly rough against hers. "Julian," he replied, though they both knew she already knew who he was. The handshake lasted a beat longer than necessary, and when he released her hand, Imani felt the absence of his touch like a small loss. "I should let you get back to work," he said, but he made no move to leave. "Right, work." The light bulb. She knelt to gather the pieces of broken glass, hyper-aware that he was still watching her. "This is not exactly the first impression I was hoping to make." "On the contrary," Julian said, his voice carrying a note she couldn't quite identify. "I have a feeling you're going to make quite an impression, Imani Davenport." As he finally turned to leave, Imani remained crouched on the floor, holding fragments of glass and wondering how 3 simple words had managed to shatter more than just a light bulb. 3 hours after the light bulb incident, Imani found herself in the mansion's laundry room, staring at what could only be described as a technological marvel disguised as a washing machine. The control panel looked like something NASA might use to launch a satellite, complete with digital displays, 17 different cycle options, and buttons labeled in what she was pretty sure was German. "Okay, fancy machine," she muttered, loading in the first batch of linens. "Let's see what you've got." She pressed what she hoped was the start button, and the machine hummed to life with a satisfied whir. Victory. Maybe she was getting the hang of this whole high-end domestic thing after all. From upstairs, she could hear the low rumble of Julian's voice as he conducted his morning conference calls. The sound seemed to vibrate through the mansion's walls, and she found herself pausing in her work to listen, not to the words, she couldn't make them out anyway, but to the cadence of his speech, authoritative, measured, completely in control. So different from the man who had looked at her with such naked surprise when she'd turned around on that ladder. The memory sent a flutter through her stomach that she determinedly ignored. She had work to do, and Julian Whitmore was her employer, not the subject of her increasingly frequent daydreams, even if he did have the kind of smile that seemed to promise secrets, and the way he'd said her name had made her feel like it was a word worth savoring. "Focus, Imani," she told herself, moving to the next task on Mrs. Hartford's meticulously organized list. "You need this job." The next item was dusting the formal dining room, which turned out to be an exercise in navigating around furniture that probably belonged in a museum. The dining table alone could seat 20 people, surrounded by chairs that looked like they'd been designed for royalty. At the room's center hung another crystal chandelier, this one even more elaborate than the one in the foyer. As she worked, carefully maneuvering her feather duster around delicate crystal drops, she found herself humming again. This time, an old Stevie Wonder song her grandmother used to play while they cleaned house together on Saturday mornings. The melody seemed to bounce off the room's high ceilings, creating an echo that made her smile. "Signed, sealed, delivered, I'm yours," she sang softly, adding a little shoulder shimmy as she moved around the table. "Stevie Wonder." Imani spun around so quickly she nearly knocked over a priceless-looking vase. Julian stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked relaxed. His tie was loosened, his jacket nowhere to be seen, and there was something approaching a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, Mr. Whitmore, I didn't hear you come in." She clutched the feather duster to her chest like a shield. "I was just dusting and apparently providing a soundtrack. Sorry about that." "Don't apologize," he said, stepping into the room. "I haven't heard anyone sing in this house well, I can't remember when." There was something almost wistful in his voice that made her tilt her head, studying his face. "You don't like music." "I like music," he said, moving closer. "I just don't often have time for it. My schedule is usually structured." "Structured," she repeated, testing the word. "That sounds exhausting." Julian's eyebrows rose slightly, as if no one had ever suggested that his carefully ordered life might be tiring. "It's efficient." "Efficient," Imani said, nodding sagely. "But is it fun? Fun isn't really the point. Maybe that's the problem." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she immediately wanted to take them back. Here she was, on her first day, basically telling her boss that his entire approach to life was wrong. This was exactly the kind of thing that had gotten her fired from her last job, when she'd laughed out loud during a meeting because her supervisor had spent 20 minutes discussing the strategic implications of office supply procurement. But instead of looking offended, Julian seemed genuinely curious. "What do you mean?" Imani set down the feather duster, weighing her words carefully. "I just think maybe life isn't supposed to be all about efficiency. Maybe it's supposed to be about the moments that catch you off guard, like hearing a song that makes you want to dance, or—" She paused, remembering the way he'd looked at her on the ladder, "or saying something you didn't plan to say." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Is that your philosophy?" "Living for the unexpected moments. Sometimes the unexpected moments are the only ones worth living for," she said, then immediately felt her cheeks heat. "I mean, not that there's anything wrong with planning. Planning is good, very responsible, but not fun," he said, and she was surprised to hear a note of teasing in his voice. "Well, no. Planning is the opposite of fun. Planning is like scheduling your spontaneity." Julian laughed, actually laughed, and the sound transformed his entire face. Gone was the stern businessman from the corporate headshots, replaced by someone who looked younger, more alive, more human. "Scheduling spontaneity," he repeated, shaking his head. "I think I may have done exactly that. See? That's the problem with you structured types. You turn everything into a project. And what's the problem with you unstructured types?" Imani grinned. "We break expensive light bulbs and sing while we work." "Ah," Julian said, nodding seriously. "The chaos theory of housekeeping." "Exactly. Chaos with a soundtrack." From somewhere in the house, a timer chimed, and Imani's eyes widened. "Oh no, the laundry." She rushed past Julian, acutely aware that her shoulder brushed against his arm as she moved, and hurried back to the laundry room. The washing machine had finished its cycle, but when she opened the lid, her heart sank. The white sheets and towels she'd loaded were now a delicate shade of pink. "No, no, no," she muttered, pulling out the ruined linens. "This is not happening. What's wrong?" Julian's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway, concern replacing the amusement that had been in his eyes moments before. "I think I may have just turned your Egyptian cotton sheets into a cotton candy color scheme," she said, holding up a sheet that was now the color of a sunset. "I'm so sorry. I'll replace them. I promise. It'll take me a few paychecks, but—" "Imani," Julian said, cutting off her panicked rambling. "It's okay. It's not okay. These probably cost more than my car. They're just sheets." She stared at him, certain she'd misheard. Just sheets. These are probably 1,000-thread-count Egyptian cotton just sheets. Julian stepped closer, taking the pink sheet from her hands and examining it with the same serious attention he'd probably given million-dollar contracts. You know what? I think I like them better this way." "You're just saying that to make me feel better." "I'm saying that because pink is a much more interesting color than white," he said, meeting her eyes. "And I'm beginning to think that interesting might be exactly what this house needs." As he handed the sheet back to her, their fingers brushed, and Imani felt that same electric jolt she'd experienced during their handshake. But this time, Julian didn't pull away immediately. This time, he let his fingers linger against hers, and in his eyes, she saw something that made her breath catch. Maybe chaos wasn't such a bad thing after all. By the end of her first week, Imani had managed to establish herself as both the most entertaining and most unpredictable member of the Whitmore household staff. She'd accidentally reorganized Julian's extensive book collection by color instead of alphabetical order, which he claimed looked surprisingly pleasing, set off the smoke alarm while attempting to make Mrs. Hartford a peace offering of cookies, and somehow got locked in the wine cellar for an hour before anyone noticed she was missing. But it was Tuesday morning of her second week when she encountered her greatest nemesis, the vacuum cleaner from hell. The machine sat in the supply closet like a sleek, silver predator, all curved lines and modern design. It looked more like a piece of contemporary art than a cleaning appliance, complete with digital displays and what appeared to be enough buttons to pilot a spacecraft. The instruction manual was thicker than most novels. "We meet again," Imani murmured, wheeling the beast out into the main hallway. She'd been avoiding this particular task, but Mrs. Hartford had finally cornered her with a pointed look and a reminder that the oriental rugs wouldn't clean themselves. The vacuum's cord was retractable, which seemed like a marvel of engineering until she tried to figure out how to actually get it to extend. After several minutes of button pressing and mild cursing, she managed to uncoil enough cord to reach the nearest outlet. The machine roared to life with a sound like a jet engine preparing for takeoff. "Holy!" Imani jumped backward as the vacuum seemed to lurch forward on its own, pulling her along like an overeager dog on a leash. Okay, we're going to work together here. No need to get aggressive." From his study down the hall, she could hear Julian on another conference call, his voice carrying that familiar tone of controlled authority. She tried to move the vacuum quietly, but the machine had apparently been designed by someone who believed that cleanliness required the sound level of a construction site. She managed to make it halfway across the Persian rug when the vacuum suddenly stopped responding to her guidance entirely. Instead of following her direction, it seemed to develop a mind of its own, careening toward the antique side table that held what looked like a very expensive lamp. No. Imani threw herself after the rebellious machine, managing to grab it just before it could commit what would undoubtedly be a fireable offense. The sudden stop sent her stumbling forward, and she found herself in an undignified tangle with the vacuum cord. "And is everything all right out there?" Julian's voice came from much closer than expected, and Imani looked up from her position on the floor, somehow wrapped in vacuum cord like a Christmas present, to find him standing in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, eyebrows raised in what might have been concern or amusement. "Just me and my new best friend here having a philosophical disagreement about the nature of carpet cleaning," she said, attempting to unwrap herself with as much dignity as possible while Julian watched. "I'll have this under control in just a—" The vacuum chose that moment to spring back to life, apparently activated by her accidental contact with one of its many mysterious buttons. It lurched forward again, dragging her several feet across the marble floor before she managed to find what she hoped was the off switch. Blessed silence fell over the hallway. Julian was speaking quietly into his phone. Gentlemen, I'm going to need to call you back in 10 minutes. Something requires my immediate attention. He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket, his full attention now focused on Imani. "And you know," he said, moving closer and extending a hand to help her up, "most people find that vacuum quite user-friendly. Most people probably don't have a talent for turning simple tasks into extreme sports," Imani replied, accepting his help and trying to ignore the way his touch sent warmth shooting up her arm. "I'm beginning to think your house is haunted by the ghost of a very judgmental cleaning lady. Mrs. Pemberton did work here for 30 years before she retired," Julian said, his mouth twitching with suppressed laughter. "She was particular about her methods. Well, Mrs. Pemberton's spirit and I are going to need to have a serious conversation about boundaries." Imani gestured at the vacuum, which now sat innocently silent. "This thing has it out for me." Julian studied the machine with the same serious attention he'd probably given quarterly profit reports. Would you like me to show you? You know how to use a vacuum?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately felt her cheeks heat. "I mean, of course you do. You're a competent adult human being, unlike me, apparently." "I wasn't always CEO of a corporation," Julian said, moving toward the vacuum. "I had to clean my own apartment through college and my first few years working." There was something almost nostalgic in his voice, and Imani found herself curious about this version of Julian, younger, less polished, pushing a vacuum around a cramped apartment after long days at some entry-level job. "Hard to imagine you with anything less than a perfectly organized life," she said. "Until you'd be surprised." He picked up the vacuum's handle, his movements confident and efficient. "The trick is understanding that it's not actually trying to fight you. It just responds to different pressure than you'd expect." He demonstrated, guiding the machine across the rug with smooth, controlled movements that made it look effortless. The vacuum hummed along obediently, no longer the rebellious beast it had been in her hands. "See? It's all about finding the right rhythm." "Show off," Imani said, but she was smiling. "Let me guess, you probably have a color-coded cleaning schedule and alphabetized your cleaning supplies." "Only the cleaning supplies," Julian replied, and she couldn't tell if he was joking. "Of course you did." She moved closer, ostensibly to watch his technique, but really because she found herself drawn to his presence in a way that was becoming harder to ignore. "Oh, what else did young Julian organize? Please tell me you labeled your socks." "I may have had a brief sock labeling phase," he admitted, and the flush that crept up his neck made him look unexpectedly boyish. "Oh my God, you really did!" Imani laughed, delighted by this glimpse into his carefully controlled personality. "What else?" "Come on, confession time." Julian paused in his vacuuming, and for a moment she thought he might actually share more of these endearing details about his past. But then his phone buzzed, and she saw him glance at it with the reflexive attention of someone whose entire life was governed by schedules and obligations. "I should get back to my call," he said, but he made no immediate move to leave. "Right, important business things." Imani took the vacuum handle from him, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Thank you for the lesson. I promise to try to maintain diplomatic relations with the vacuum from now on." "Imani," Julian said, his voice carrying a note she couldn't quite identify. "If you need help with anything else, any of the equipment, or are you offering to teach me how to use the coffee machine next? Because that thing looks like it requires a PhD in engineering, if necessary," he said, and there was something in his eyes that made her think he wasn't entirely joking. As he walked back toward his study, Imani watched him go, noting the way his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of constant responsibility. She found herself wondering what it would be like to see him truly relaxed, without the armor of his perfectly pressed suits and scheduled life. The vacuum hummed to life under her guidance, finally cooperating, and she smiled to herself. Maybe she was starting to understand the rhythm of more than just the cleaning equipment. The kitchen at 3 a.m. was a different world entirely. Soft under-cabinet lighting cast everything in warm amber tones, and the usual bustle of daytime activity had given way to the kind of peaceful silence that made even breathing feel deliberate. Imani sat at the large center island, laptop open, surrounded by job applications she'd been putting off for weeks. She hadn't planned to be up this late, but sleep had been elusive, her mind too busy replaying moments from the past 2 weeks. Julian's laugh echoing in the dining room, the way his eyes had lingered on her face during the vacuum lesson, the careful distance he maintained even as she caught him watching her work. The coffee machine, the intimidating beast Julian had jokingly offered to teach her to use, loomed in the corner like a chrome monument to overcomplicated technology. She'd been surviving on instant coffee from the staff room, but tonight felt like the kind of night that required real caffeine. How hard could it be? She murmured, approaching the machine with the same caution she might use to disarm a bomb. 20 minutes later, she'd managed to produce something that technically qualified as coffee, though it bore little resemblance to the perfectly crafted cups she'd seen Julian drinking. Still, it was hot and caffeinated, which met her current requirements. She was settling back at the island with her laptop when footsteps on the marble floor made her freeze. Julian appeared in the doorway, hair mussed and wearing a navy Henley and pajama pants that made him look younger and somehow more approachable than his usual business attire allowed. "Imani." His voice was rough with sleep and surprise. What are you doing up?" "I could ask you the same thing," she said, suddenly self-conscious about being caught in the kitchen in her own pajamas, flannel pants covered in cartoon cats, and an oversized Howard University t-shirt that had seen better days. "Couldn't sleep. I often come down here when—" He paused, seeming to catch himself before revealing too much. "I saw the light on." Julian moved into the kitchen with the careful movements of someone trying not to fully wake up, and Imani found herself studying this different version of him. Without the armor of his perfectly tailored suits, he looked more human, more reachable. "I made coffee," she offered, gesturing toward the machine. "Well, I made something coffee-adjacent. I can't promise it won't dissolve your dental work." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That brave, are you?" "I prefer to think of it as optimistically reckless." Julian moved to the machine, pressing a few buttons with practiced efficiency. The device hummed to life, producing a much more promising sound than her earlier attempts had managed. "The secret," he said, glancing over his shoulder at her, "is understanding that it's essentially a very sophisticated robot. You have to speak its language." "And what language is that?" "Pretentious technology. Precision," he said, but he was smiling now. "Everything has its proper sequence, its timing." "Of course it does," Imani said, watching as he moved through the coffee-making process with the same methodical attention he probably applied to everything in his life. "Do you ever do anything without a plan?" Julian paused, coffee cup halfway to his lips. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you ever just wing it? Make decisions in the moment without analyzing all the variables first?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Imani worried she'd overstepped some invisible boundary, but then he moved to sit across from her at the island, cradling his coffee cup between his hands. "I used to," he said quietly. "When I was younger, I made a lot of impulsive decisions. Most of them turned out badly." There was something in his voice, a carefully controlled vulnerability, that made her close her laptop and give him her full attention. "What changed?" "Responsibility, I suppose. When you're responsible for other people's livelihoods, other people's futures, spontaneity becomes expensive." Imani studied his face in the soft kitchen light, noting the way tension seemed to live in the set of his shoulders, even when he was trying to relax. "That sounds lonely," she said gently. Julian's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something flicker there. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "I hadn't thought of it that way. When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to? Not because it was scheduled or planned or strategically sound, but just because it felt right in the moment?" The question hung between them in the quiet kitchen, and Julian was silent for so long that Imani began to wonder if she'd pushed too far. But finally, he spoke. "I'm not sure I remember." The admission seemed to cost him something, and Imani felt her heart squeeze with unexpected tenderness. Here was this incredibly successful, powerful man, and he looked genuinely confused by the concept of spontaneous joy. "That's heartbreaking," she said softly. "Is it? I've built a good life, a successful company, financial security. But are you happy?" The directness of the question seemed to catch him off guard. He stared down at his coffee cup, and Imani could almost see him processing the question like it was a complex business problem requiring careful analysis. "I'm satisfied," he said finally. "That's not the same thing, isn't it? Not even close." Imani leaned forward, animated by a sudden desire to make him understand. "Satisfaction is like efficient nutrition. It meets your basic needs, but it doesn't make you excited to get up in the morning. Happiness is the difference between surviving and actually living." Julian looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw something that looked almost like hunger, not for food or coffee, but for the kind of uncomplicated joy she was describing. "And you're happy?" he asked. Imani considered the question honestly. "I'm working on it. I've made some spectacularly bad decisions in pursuit of happiness, but at least I've never been accused of playing it safe." "Hence the job applications at 3 a.m.? She glanced at her closed laptop, surprised he'd noticed. "Research. I'm trying to figure out what comes next." "You're leaving?" There was something in his voice. Was it disappointment that made her pulse quicken? "Oh, but the position is temporary," she reminded him, though saying it out loud felt stranger than she'd expected. Mrs. Hartford made that very clear. "Right, of course." Julian's expression seemed to close off slightly, and she felt the loss of that momentary openness like a physical thing. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, drinking their coffee and existing in the peaceful bubble of the quiet kitchen. Finally, Julian spoke again. "What did you want to be when you were a child?" The question was so unexpected that Imani nearly choked on her coffee. "Random topic change much? You said I should try being more spontaneous." The fact that he was actively trying to follow her advice made something warm bloom in her chest. "A teacher," she said. "I wanted to be a teacher. What about you?" "An astronaut." "Seriously?" "Dead serious. I had the whole thing planned out. NASA training, moon missions. The works." "What happened?" Julian's smile was rueful. "I grew up, realized that space exploration wasn't exactly a stable career path. So you chose stability over dreams. I chose responsibility over fantasy." "Same thing, really." Julian was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you ever regret not becoming a teacher?" "Every day," Imani admitted. "But I also know it's not too late. That's the difference between us, I think. You see closed doors, where I see detours." As they talked, the sky outside began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, and Imani realized they'd been sitting in the kitchen for over an hour. It felt like minutes. "I should let you get some sleep," Julian said, standing and rinsing his coffee cup with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "Julian," she said as he reached the doorway. He turned back, eyebrows raised in question. "Thanks for the coffee lesson, and for the conversation. Thank you," he said quietly, "for reminding me what it feels like to have an unscheduled moment." After he left, Imani sat alone in the kitchen as morning light gradually filled the space, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something important had shifted between them in the quiet hours before dawn. The thunderstorm hit Boston with the dramatic flair of a Broadway opening night, complete with lightning that turned the mansion's windows into strobing screens, and thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of Julian's carefully ordered world. By noon, the power had flickered 3 times, and Mrs. Hartford was muttering darkly about the unreliability of modern electrical systems. Imani was in the sunroom, though sun seemed like a misnomer given the apocalyptic weather outside, attempting to water the collection of orchids that Julian apparently collected like other people collected coffee mugs. She'd discovered his unexpected hobby the previous week and had been secretly charmed by this evidence that the man who scheduled his breathing might have a soft spot for something as delicate and unpredictable as flowers. The orchids were finicky creatures, requiring precisely the right amount of water, specific humidity levels, and what the care instructions described as indirect bright light, a phrase that seemed designed to confuse anyone who wasn't a botanist. But Imani had always been good with plants, a skill inherited from her grandmother who could coax roses to bloom in the middle of winter. "Okay, beautiful," she murmured to a particularly elegant white orchid. "Let's see if we can keep you happy today." The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up to find Julian standing in the doorway, and her heart did that now familiar skip that seemed to happen whenever he appeared unexpectedly. He was holding a tablet and wearing the slightly frazzled expression of someone whose perfectly planned day had been derailed by Mother Nature. "Did the storm knock out the internet?" he said without preamble. "My conference call was cut off mid-sentence, and I have 3 presentations to review before tomorrow." "That's terrible," Imani said, though privately she thought it might be the best thing that had happened to him in months. "What will you do?" Julian stared at his tablet like it had personally betrayed him. "I'm not sure. I could drive to the office, but the roads—" As if summoned by his words, another crack of thunder shook the house, and rain lashed against the sunroom's glass walls with renewed intensity. "Yeah, I don't think you're driving anywhere in this," Imani said. "Looks like you're stuck here, with nothing to do." The horror on his face at the concept of unstructured time would have been comical if it wasn't so genuinely distressing to him. "I could reorganize my files," he said, already moving toward what Imani had come to recognize as his default crisis mode, finding something productive to control. "Or," she said, setting down the watering can and turning to face him fully, "you could try something revolutionary." "Which is?" "Nothing." Julian blinked at her like she'd suggested he juggle fire. "Nothing. Nothing. Just exist. Enjoy the storm. Watch the rain. Maybe even, and I know this is going to sound crazy, relax." "I don't really know how to relax." The admission was so honest and vulnerable that Imani felt something squeezed tight in her chest. Here was this incredibly successful man, and he looked genuinely lost at the prospect of having an unscheduled hour. "Lucky for you," she said, moving closer. "I'm an excellent teacher." "I thought you said you weren't a teacher." "I said I wasn't a teacher yet." "There's a difference." Another flash of lightning illuminated the sunroom, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to roll on forever. The rain was coming down so hard now that the world outside had become a blur of grey and green. "It's beautiful," Imani said, moving to stand near the wall of windows. "It's chaos," Julian replied, but he moved to stand beside her. "The same thing, sometimes." They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the storm rage outside. Imani was acutely aware of Julian's presence beside her, the warmth radiating from his body, the way he smelled like expensive cologne and something uniquely him, the careful way he held himself even when trying to relax. "When I was little," she said quietly, "my grandmother used to take me out in storms like this. We'd dance in the rain until we were soaked through, then come inside for hot chocolate and terrible movies. Weren't you afraid of getting struck by lightning?" "Terrified," Imani laughed, but Grandma said fear was just excitement wearing a disguise. She said if you let fear make all your decisions, you'd miss out on all the best parts of being alive. Julian was quiet for a long moment. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. "She's also the one who taught me that happiness isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose to create, even when everything around you is falling apart." "Is that what you're doing here, creating happiness?" The question caught her off guard with its directness. She turned to look at him, finding his grey eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'm trying to," she said honestly. "What about you? Are you happy here? In your perfectly organized life?" "I was content," Julian said slowly. Before what? Before you arrived and started asking questions, I don't know how to answer." The honesty in his voice made something flutter in her stomach. They were standing closer now, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes, close enough to notice the way his breathing had changed. "Maybe," she said softly. The point isn't to know the answers. Maybe the point is to be brave enough to ask the questions. Lightning flashed again, and in the brief, brilliant illumination, Julian's face was stark with something that looked like longing. When the thunder came, it seemed to shake something loose in him. "Imani," he said, her name rough on his lips. The lights went out. Complete darkness enveloped the sunroom, broken only by the intermittent flashes of lightning outside. In the sudden intimacy of the blackout, Imani could hear Julian's breathing, could sense his presence in the darkness. "Well," she said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet, "I guess this is what your grandmother would call an adventure. My grandmother would have called this poor electrical infrastructure and inadequate backup systems." Imani laughed, and the sound seemed to break some of the tension. "Your grandmother sounds like she and mine would have gotten along famously. They both believed in being prepared for anything. The difference is, mine believed in dancing through the chaos." Another flash of lightning illuminated Julian's face, and in that brief moment, Imani saw something shift in his expression. "Teach me," he said quietly. "Teach you what? To dance through the chaos." Before she could overthink it, before she could analyze the wisdom of what she was about to do, Imani reached out in the darkness and found his hand. His fingers were warm and slightly rough, and when he squeezed gently, she felt something electric that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "The first rule," she said, pulling him gently away from the windows, "is that there are no rules. Just move." "I don't hear any music." "Then make some." And in the darkness of the sunroom, with lightning flashing outside and thunder providing a dramatic soundtrack, Imani began to hum. It was the same Stevie Wonder song she'd been singing when Julian first heard her, and after a moment she felt him begin to move with her. They swayed together in the darkness, not really dancing but not quite standing still either, and Imani thought that maybe this was what happiness felt like, not the explosive joy of big moments, but the quiet contentment of being exactly where you belonged, even when the lights went out, especially when the lights went out. The morning after the storm dawned crystal clear, as if nature was apologizing for the previous day's dramatics. Sunlight streamed through the mansion's windows with an almost aggressive cheerfulness, illuminating a world that looked freshly washed and impossibly green. Imani woke earlier than usual, her sleep having been restless and filled with dreams of dancing in the dark and the warm press of Julian's hand in hers. The memory of their impromptu dance lesson sent a flutter through her stomach that she tried unsuccessfully to ignore as she got ready for work. By the time she made it downstairs, the power had been restored, and the mansion hummed with its usual efficient energy. Mrs. Hartford was already bustling about the kitchen, directing the morning staff with military precision, and everything seemed to have returned to normal. Everything except the way Julian looked at her when she walked into the dining room to refresh the flower arrangements. He was seated at the head of the massive table, laptop open, coffee cup at his elbow, looking every inch the composed businessman in his charcoal suit and perfectly knotted tie. But when his eyes met hers across the room, there was something different there, a warmth, an awareness that made her pulse quicken. "Good morning," he said, his voice carefully neutral in a way that somehow managed to convey the opposite of neutrality. "Morning," she replied, moving to the sideboard where yesterday's flowers drooped sadly in their crystal vase. "Looks like the storm cleared up nicely." "Yes, it did." There was a pause, filled with the weight of everything they weren't saying about the previous evening. "The internet is back up. I was able to reschedule my conference calls. Back to the regularly scheduled programming," Imani said, arranging fresh white roses with perhaps more attention than the task required. "Something like that." She could feel him watching her as she worked, and the awareness of his gaze made her fingers fumble with the flower stems. This was ridiculous. She was a grown woman, not some teenager developing a crush on the unattainable boy in chemistry class. Except Julian Whitmore was proving to be far from unattainable, and that realization was more terrifying than any storm. "Imani," Her name on his lips made her look up from the roses. "About last night, Mr. Whitmore." Mrs. Hartford's voice cut through the moment like a sword through silk. "Your assistant called. The Meridian Group meeting has been moved up to 10 o'clock. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Imani saw him slip back into his professional mask as smoothly as putting on a jacket. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartford. I'll head to the office shortly." "Very good, sir." Mrs. Hartford's sharp eyes flicked between them, and Imani had the uncomfortable feeling that the older woman was cataloguing every detail of their interaction for future reference. After Mrs. Hartford swept out of the room, silence settled between them again, but it felt different now, more charged, more fragile. "You should go," Imani said quietly, turning back to the flowers. "Important business things waiting." "Right." But Julian made no move to leave. Instead, he closed his laptop and stood, moving closer to where she worked. "Imani, what happened last night?" "Was a power outage," she finished for him, not trusting herself to look at him. "People do strange things when the lights go out. It doesn't have to mean anything." The silence that followed was so complete, she could hear the soft tick of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. "And if I want it to mean something?" The quiet question made her hands still on the flower stems. Slowly, she turned to face him, and the expression in his grey eyes made her breath catch. Gone was the careful professional distance, replaced by something raw and honest that made her heart race. "Julian," she said softly, "you don't want to complicate your life with someone like me, someone like you, and someone who breaks expensive light bulbs and turns your sheets pink and doesn't know how to operate a vacuum cleaner without starting a small war. Someone who laughs in dark rooms and teaches uptight CEOs how to dance and makes everything in this house feel more alive than it has in years." The words hung between them, and Imani felt something shift in her chest, a dangerous loosening of the careful walls she'd built around her heart. "Your life is perfect," she said. "Organized, successful, predictable. I'm chaos in human form. We don't make sense." "My life isn't perfect," Julian said, stepping closer. "It's empty. It's scheduled and efficient and completely, utterly empty. And you—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "You make me remember what it feels like to want something I can't plan for. Julian, have dinner with me." The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back and they'd finally broken free. "Not as your employer, not as part of any schedule or obligation. Just have dinner with me, please." Imani stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was dangerous territory, the kind of emotional quicksand that could swallow everything she'd worked to build for herself. But looking at Julian, really looking at him, she saw something that made her resolve waver. Under all that controlled perfection was a man who looked like he was holding his breath, waiting for her answer. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Neither do I," Julian admitted, with a rueful smile. I think it's probably a terrible idea that will complicate everything and go against every principle of professional conduct I've ever believed in." "Then why?" "Because terrible ideas are the only ones worth having, apparently. At least, that's what someone very wise told me yesterday." Despite herself, Imani smiled. "That someone sounds like a troublemaker." "She is. She's also the first person in years to make me want to do something completely spontaneous and possibly stupid." His phone buzzed on the table, displaying what was undoubtedly a reminder about his rescheduled meeting. Julian glanced at it, then deliberately turned the device face down. "One dinner," he said. "What's the worst that could happen?" "Famous last words," Imani said, but she was already feeling her careful resolve crumbling. "Oh, I could spill wine on your expensive suit. I could say something inappropriate and embarrass you in front of important people. I could fall asleep during dessert from boredom because I spend the entire evening talking about quarterly projections. I was going to say fall for you and make everything impossibly complicated, but your thing works too." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she immediately felt her cheeks flame. But Julian's expression softened, and when he smiled, it was the first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him. "Imani," he said gently, "I think we passed impossibly complicated about the time you turned my life pink. That was an accident. The best things usually are." His phone buzzed again, more insistently this time, and Julian sighed. "I really do have to go." "I know, but dinner, tonight. Will you think about it?" Looking at him, this successful, put-together man who was asking her to dinner like a nervous teenager, Imani felt something dangerous and wonderful unfold in her chest. "I'll think about it," she said. Julian's smile was radiant. "That's all I can ask for." As he gathered his things and headed for the door, he paused at the threshold. "Imani, for what it's worth, I don't think you're chaos. I think you're possibility." And then he was gone, leaving her alone with the flowers and the sunlight and the terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that her carefully simple life was about to become anything but. Imani changed clothes 4 times before settling on a navy dress that struck what she hoped was the right balance between "I care about this" and "I'm not trying too hard." The dress was simple, elegant without being fancy, and most importantly, it was unlikely to result in any wardrobe malfunctions that might end up in tomorrow's society pages. Julian had insisted on picking her up from her apartment in Dorchester, despite her protests that she could meet him at the restaurant. When she opened her door at exactly 7 o'clock, she found him standing in her hallway, looking like he'd stepped out of a magazine. Charcoal grey suit replaced by dark jeans and a navy button-down that made his eyes look like storm clouds. "You look beautiful," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her stomach flutter. "You look—" She paused, taking in this more casual version of him. "Different, good different. I figured a suit might be overkill for our first non-work encounter." "Our first date," she corrected, then felt her cheeks warm. "I mean, if that's what this is." "It's definitely what this is," Julian said, his smile soft and sure. "Ready?" The restaurant he'd chosen was perfect, intimate without being stuffy, elegant without being intimidating. Not the kind of place where she'd worry about using the wrong fork or accidentally ordering something she couldn't pronounce. As they were seated at a corner table with soft candlelight and a view of the harbour, Imani realized he'd put thought into choosing somewhere she'd feel comfortable. "This is lovely," she said, accepting the wine menu from their server. "I wasn't sure what you'd like," Julian admitted. "And I realized I know remarkably little about your preferences outside of your opinion on vacuum cleaners and your talent for inadvertent interior decorating. Well, you know I like Stevie Wonder and coffee that doesn't require an engineering degree to make." "True. What else should I know about Imani Davenport?" The question, asked with genuine curiosity, caught her off guard. When was the last time someone had asked her about herself, like her answer actually mattered? "I'm an only child who always wanted siblings," she said. "I collect vintage postcards from places I've never been. I make excellent grilled cheese sandwiches, but somehow manage to burn water when I try to cook anything else. And I have an irrational fear of butterflies." Butterflies. They're unpredictable. All that fluttering around with no apparent plan or purpose. Julian laughed, the sound rich and warm. That's ironic, coming from someone who advocates for spontaneity." "There's a difference between spontaneity and chaos," Imani protested. "Spontaneity has intention behind it, even if it's spur of the moment. Butterflies are just random." "I think you might be overthinking butterflies," says the man who probably has his socks organized by color. "Actually, I switched to organizing them by fabric weight after our conversation about sock labeling. Much more practical." Imani stared at him across the candlelit table. "Please tell me you're joking." "Completely serious. Cotton blends on the left, merino wool on the right, athletic wear in a separate drawer entirely. Julian Whitmore, you are either the most charmingly neurotic man I've ever met, or you're pulling my leg. Can't it be both?" Their conversation flowed as easily as the wine, moving from silly topics to serious ones and back again. Julian told her about his childhood in Connecticut, the pressure of living up to family expectations, and his father's disappointment when he chose business school over law. Imani shared stories about growing up with her grandmother after her parents died, the string of odd jobs that had led her to his doorstep, and her dream of eventually going back to school. Teaching, Julian said when she mentioned her long-term plans. You'd be good at it. What makes you say that? You made me understand the difference between satisfaction and happiness in a single conversation. You taught me to use a vacuum cleaner without making me feel incompetent, and you somehow convinced me that pink sheets were an improvement. He paused, swirling his wine. You have a gift for making people see things differently. Maybe I just have a gift for causing trouble. Maybe that's the same thing. As the evening progressed, Imani found herself studying this version of Julian, relaxed, funny, surprisingly self-deprecating. Without the armor of his business persona, he was warmer, more accessible, and devastatingly attractive in a way that made her heart race. "Can I ask you something?" she said, as they shared dessert. "Anything. What made you ask me to dinner? Really?" Julian was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Honestly, you scare me." "I scare you?" Imani laughed. "I'm the least scary person on the planet. I'm afraid of butterflies. Remember? You scare me because you make me want things I didn't know I was missing," he said quietly. "You walk into a room and suddenly everything feels more colorful, more alive, more worth paying attention to. I've spent so long focusing on building something secure and predictable that I forgot what it felt like to want something just because it makes me happy." The honesty in his voice made her chest tight. "And I make you happy." Terrifyingly so. They walked slowly back to his car after dinner, neither seeming eager to end the evening. The harbor was beautiful at night, lights reflecting off the water like scattered stars, and for once, Julian wasn't checking his phone or glancing at his watch. "Thank you," Imani said as they reached her building. "For dinner, for this. It was perfect, even though I spent 10 minutes explaining my sock organization system. Especially because of that." Julian walked her to her door, and as they stood in the dim hallway light, the air between them seemed to crackle with possibility. "Imani," he said softly, "I know this is complicated. I know there are a dozen reasons why this is probably a bad idea, probably more than a dozen, but I can't stop thinking about dancing with you in the dark, about the way you laugh when you're trying not to, about how everything feels different when you're around." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Tell me I'm not imagining this," he said. "Tell me you feel it too." Instead of answering with words, Imani rose up on her toes and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, but when Julian's arms came around her waist and pulled her closer, something ignited between them. He kissed her like she was oxygen, and he'd been holding his breath for years, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "Definitely not imagining it," Imani whispered against his lips. Julian rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "This is going to change everything." "I know. Are you ready for that?" Imani thought about her careful, simple life, about the job applications on her laptop, and the temporary nature of her position in his world. Then she looked at Julian, this brilliant, complicated man who organized his socks and asked her to teach him to dance in the dark, and made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. "And I guess we'll find out together." When Julian finally left, Imani leaned against her closed door and touched her lips, still tingling from his kiss. Outside her window, the city lights twinkled like possibilities, and for the first time in a long time, she had no idea what tomorrow would bring. She'd never been more excited to find out. The morning after their first date, Imani arrived at work, floating on a cloud of post-kiss euphoria that lasted exactly until she walked into the kitchen and found Mrs. Hartford waiting for her with the expression of a hanging judge. "Miss Davenport," the housekeeper said, her voice carrying enough ice to freeze the harbor. We need to have a conversation. Imani's stomach dropped somewhere around her ankles. Of course, Mrs. Hartford. Is there a problem with my work? The problem, Miss Davenport, is not with your work. The problem is with your apparent confusion about the nature of your employment here. The words hit like physical blows, and Imani felt her face flush with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. She should have known this was coming, should have realized that in a house this size, with this many staff members, nothing stayed secret for long. "And I'm not sure what you mean," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. "Mr. Whitmore's car was seen in your neighborhood last evening, the same evening he cancelled his usual Tuesday night conference call with the London office." Mrs. Hartford's sharp eyes seemed to catalogue every detail of Imani's appearance, looking for evidence of guilt. "I've been managing this household for 15 years, Miss Davenport. I've seen what happens when boundaries are forgotten." "Mrs. Hartford, Let me be very clear," the older woman interrupted. "Mr. Whitmore is a good man, but he's also a busy man who sometimes makes impulsive decisions when he's under stress. The Meridian merger is approaching. He'll be traveling extensively over the next few months, and his judgment may not be as sound as usual." Each word felt carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage, and Imani found herself gripping the edge of the kitchen counter for support. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that temporary employees who forget their place tend to find their employment becoming even more temporary than originally planned, Mrs. Hartford's voice softened slightly, but the steel underneath remained. "You seem like a nice girl, Imani. Don't let yourself become a casualty of someone else's momentary lapse in judgment." Before Imani could respond, the sound of Julian's voice echoed from the front hall, accompanied by footsteps and what sounded like rolling luggage. "Mrs. Hartford, could you have the car brought around? The flight's been moved up." The housekeeper's expression shifted instantly from stern disapproval to professional efficiency. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. I'll call Harrison immediately." As Mrs. Hartford swept out of the kitchen, Imani stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Momentary lapse in judgment. The words echoed in her head like an accusation. Was that all last night had been? A mistake made by a stressed businessman who would regret it once he came to his senses. She forced herself to move, to appear busy when Julian inevitably came looking for her. But when he appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking harried and professional in his perfectly pressed suit, she felt something inside her chest crack. "Imani," he said, and his voice was warm with pleasure at seeing her. "I was hoping to catch you before I left." "Left?" The word came out smaller than she'd intended. "The Meridian Group moved up the preliminary meetings. I'm flying to Singapore tonight instead of next week." He moved closer, and she caught the familiar scent of his cologne. "I'll be gone for at least 10 days, possibly longer." That's sudden. Corporate mergers rarely follow anyone's preferred timeline. Julian paused, studying her face. "Are you all right?" "You look fine," she said quickly. "I'm just tired." "About last night, you should probably focus on your trip," Imani interrupted, Mrs. Hartford's words ringing in her ears. "Important business things." Julian's expression shifted, confusion replacing warmth. "Imani, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. You have a flight to catch, and I have work to do." She turned away from him, busying herself with reorganizing already organized cleaning supplies. "Have a safe trip, Mr. Whitmore." The formal address hung between them like a wall, and she heard Julian's sharp intake of breath. "Mr. Whitmore, since when do you—" He stopped, and when he spoke again, his voice was careful, controlled. "Did something happen? Did someone say something to you?" "Like what?" "Like anything. About us." "About last night." The vulnerability in his voice made her want to turn around, to throw herself into his arms and forget everything Mrs. Hartford had said. But the older woman's words echoed too loudly. Momentary lapse in judgment, temporary employee. Don't let yourself become a casualty. "There is no you see," she said quietly. "Last night was nice, but you're you, and I'm me, and we both know this can't go anywhere." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the kitchen clock ticking, counting down the seconds until her heart finished breaking. "I see," Julian said finally, his voice stripped of all emotion. "Well, thank you for clarifying." "Julian, Mr. Whitmore," he corrected coldly. "And if we're returning to formalities—" She heard his footsteps retreat, heard the front door slam, heard the car pull away from the circular drive. Only then did she allow herself to turn around, to lean against the counter and slide slowly to the floor as the tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. Mrs. Hartford found her there 20 minutes later, sitting on the kitchen floor with her knees drawn up to her chest, crying like her heart was breaking. "Because it was, oh child," the housekeeper said, her voice gentler than Imani had ever heard it. "I'm sorry, but it's better this way. Trust me." "Is it?" Imani asked through her tears. "Because it doesn't feel better. It feels like I just threw away the best thing that's ever happened to me. Sometimes the best things are the ones that hurt us most if we're not careful." Mrs. Hartford sat down on the floor beside her, an action so unexpected that Imani stopped crying in shock. "I've seen too many girls like you get their hearts broken by men like him, not because he's cruel, but because his world and yours, they don't fit together easily. He said I made him happy. I'm sure you do. But happiness and compatibility aren't the same thing, dear. And when the novelty wears off, when the real world intrudes, that's when people get hurt." Imani wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "So what am I supposed to do? Pretend last night never happened? You're supposed to remember that you're stronger than this, that you came here to work, to save money, to build something better for yourself. Don't let a pair of pretty grey eyes derail those plans." As Mrs. Hartford helped her to her feet and handed her a tissue, Imani felt something harden inside her chest. Maybe the older woman was right. Maybe she had been fooling herself, thinking that someone like Julian could really want someone like her for more than a momentary distraction. "He'll be gone for 10 days, Mrs. Hartford said gently. "Use that time to remember who you are without him." Nodding, Imani straightened her shoulders and wiped the last of the tears from her cheeks. 10 days to get her heart back under control. 10 days to remember that Julian Whitmore was her employer, not her future. 10 days to figure out how to stop loving someone who had probably already forgotten her name. As she returned to her duties, moving through the mansion like a ghost, Imani tried not to think about the way Julian had said her name that morning, like it was something precious. Tried not to remember the warmth in his eyes or the careful way he'd kissed her goodnight. Tried not to wonder if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. 10 days without Julian felt like 10 years. Imani moved through the mansion like a woman underwater, performing her duties with mechanical precision while her heart remained stubbornly, painfully absent. The house seemed larger somehow, echoing with his absence in ways that made her chest ache every time she passed his empty office or caught sight of his unused coffee cup in the kitchen. On day 11, she found herself in his study, ostensibly dusting but really just absorbing the space that still smelled faintly of his cologne. The orchids in the sunroom had begun to droop despite her careful attention, as if they too were mourning his absence. She'd caught herself staring at her phone countless times, hoping for a message that never came. Mrs. Hartford had been kinder these past days, bringing her tea and making gentle conversation, but Imani could see the relief in the older woman's eyes, relief that the situation had been handled before it could become more complicated. It was while she was watering the orchids that she heard the front door slam with enough force to rattle the windows. Julian was back. Her hands trembled as she set down the watering can, and she pressed her palms against her thighs to steady them. She could hear his voice in the front hall, clipped and professional as he spoke to Mrs. Hartford about schedules and correspondence. He sounded tired, frustrated, and completely uninterested in small talk. Imani forced herself to continue her work, even as every cell in her body screamed for her to run to him, to ask about his trip, to see if the distance had been as hard for him as it had been for her. 20 minutes later, he appeared in the sunroom doorway. He looked awful. His usually immaculate hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too little sleep and too much stress. But it was the careful blankness in his expression that made her heart clench. "Miss Davenport," he said formally, "Mrs. Hartford mentioned you've been taking care of the orchids." "Yes, sir." The words felt like glass in her throat. "Thank you. I appreciate your thoroughness." They stood in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the flowers they'd discussed on more intimate occasions, and the space between them felt like an ocean. Imani wanted to ask about Singapore, about the merger, about whether he'd thought of her at all during the long days away. Instead, she nodded and turned back to the plants. "How was your trip?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Successful. The merger will proceed as planned." Julian moved into the room, but maintained careful distance. "I'll be traveling frequently over the next several months. London, Tokyo, Sydney. The integration process is complex." "That sounds exciting. International business and all." "Exciting isn't the word I'd use." Something in his tone made her look up, and for just a moment she saw past his professional mask to the exhaustion underneath. He looked like a man running on empty, going through the motions of a life that no longer fit properly. "Are you happy?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, echoing their conversation from that first night in the kitchen. Julian's jaw tightened. "Happiness is a luxury I can't afford right now, Miss Davenport. I have responsibilities, obligations that extend far beyond my personal preferences." "Right, of course." Imani set down the watering can with more force than necessary. "Wouldn't want personal preferences to interfere with business." "Is that supposed to mean something?" The careful control in his voice finally snapped something inside her. All the hurt and confusion and loneliness of the past 10 days came rushing to the surface. "It means that some of us don't have the luxury of compartmentalizing our feelings like line items in a budget," she said, her voice rising. "It means that some of us can't just turn emotions on and off based on what's convenient for our schedules." "You think this is convenient for me?" Julian's mask slipped, revealing anger and something that looked like pain. "You think any of this is easy?" "I think you're a coward." The words hung between them like a slap, and Julian's face went white. "I beg your pardon." "You heard me. You're a coward who hides behind schedules and obligations because actually feeling something, actually taking a risk, might mess up your perfectly organized life." "A coward?" Julian's voice was deadly quiet. "I'm a coward because I understand the difference between fantasy and reality. Because I recognize that some things, no matter how appealing they might seem in the moment, are ultimately impossible." "No, you're a coward because you'd rather give up than fight for something that makes you happy." "And what would you have me fight?" "Exactly. The fact that you work for me, the fact that we come from completely different worlds. The fact that this entire situation is a recipe for disaster that could destroy both our careers. I'd have you fight for me." The words exploded out of her, raw and desperate. "I'd have you fight for us, for what we could be if you'd just stop being so terrified of what might go wrong and start thinking about what might go right." Julian stared at her, his breathing harsh, and for a moment she thought she saw something crack in his armor. But then his phone buzzed, and the moment shattered. He glanced at the device automatically, and Imani saw the exact second he retreated back into his safe, controlled world. "I have a conference call," he said, his voice empty. "Please finish with the orchids and then help Mrs. Hartford with the evening preparations. I'll be dining out tonight." "Julian, Mr. Whitmore," he corrected without looking at her. "And I think it would be best if we maintained appropriate professional boundaries going forward, Miss Davenport. Clearly, we both allowed our judgment to become compromised." The clinical term felt like a knife between her ribs. Compromised. As if what they'd shared was a malfunction rather than something beautiful. "Fine," she said, her voice flat. "Professional boundaries. Got it." Julian paused at the doorway, his back to her. "Imani, Miss Davenport," she corrected coldly. "If we're being professional." He left without another word. and Imani sank into one of the wicker chairs, staring at the orchids through a blur of tears. Around her, the sunroom felt hollow, emptied of all the warmth and possibility that had once made it feel magical. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to the draft email she'd been working on for days, her formal resignation, typed and retyped, but never sent. Her finger hovered over the send button. Maybe Mrs. Hartford was right. Maybe some things were impossible, no matter how much you wanted them. Maybe it was time to stop fighting for someone who had already decided she wasn't worth the battle. But as she sat there, surrounded by Julian's carefully tended flowers, Imani realized she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not when she could still see glimpses of the man who had danced with her in the dark, who had told her she made him want things he didn't know he was missing. There had to be a way to make him remember that some things were worth fighting for, even if it meant risking everything to try. The resignation letter sat on Julian's desk for 3 days before he found it, buried beneath a stack of merger documents and quarterly reports. The pink paper, of course she'd used pink paper, seemed to glow against the mahogany surface, and when he unfolded it, her handwriting greeted him like a punch to the gut. "Dear Mr. Whitmore, please accept this as my formal notice of resignation from my position as temporary household staff. My last day will be Friday. Thank you for the opportunity. Sincerely, Imani Davenport, P.S. The orchids need water twice a week, not 3 times. I think I was overcompensating." Julian stared at the note, his chest tightening with something that felt like panic. She was leaving, actually leaving. The thought hit him with unexpected force, followed immediately by the realization that he'd been so buried in work, so determined to maintain professional boundaries, that he hadn't even noticed she was gone. How long had it been since he'd seen her? Since he'd heard her laugh echoing through the halls or caught her humming while she worked? The mansion felt different, quieter, greyer, emptier, like all the colour had been drained out of it. He was still staring at the letter when Mrs. Hartford knocked on his study door. "Come in," he called, not looking up. "Mr. Whitmore, about Miss Davenport's replacement." "No." The word came out sharper than he'd intended. Mrs. Hartford paused, clearly taken aback. "Sir, no replacement. We'll manage without additional temporary staff. But, sir, the household requirements can be handled by the existing staff," Julian said firmly. "Was there anything else?" Mrs. Hartford was quiet for a long moment, and when Julian finally looked up, he found her studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "She was a good worker," the housekeeper said carefully. "Imani, a bit unconventional in her methods, but she had a good heart." "Yes, well, good hearts don't always translate to appropriate professional conduct." "No, sir, they don't." Mrs. Hartford moved closer to his desk. "May I speak freely, Mr. Whitmore?" Julian gestured for her to continue, though something in her tone made him wary. "I've worked for your family for 15 years. I've seen you build this company, achieve everything you set out to accomplish. But I've never seen you as happy as you were these past few weeks. Happiness is not a luxury," Mrs. Hartford interrupted gently. "It's a necessity, and that girl, she brought something to this house that's been missing for a very long time. Mrs. Hartford, she brought life, sir. Laughter, joy, things that all the success in the world can't buy." The older woman's voice softened. "And I thought I was protecting you both by encouraging her to maintain distance. But perhaps some risks are worth taking." Julian set down the resignation letter, his hands not quite steady. "It's too late. She's made her choice." "Has she? Or did she make the choice she thought you wanted her to make?" The question hit like a physical blow, and Julian felt something crack open in his chest. Had he pushed Imani away so thoroughly that she'd given up on them entirely? Had his fear of complication, of messiness, of anything that couldn't be controlled and scheduled, cost him the best thing that had ever happened to him? "Where is she?" he asked quietly. "In her room, packing." "But, sir..." Julian was already moving, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He'd been an idiot, a coward, just like she'd said. He'd been so afraid of disrupting his carefully ordered life that he'd forgotten what it felt like to actually live. He found Imani's door ajar, soft music drifting out into the hallway. When he peered inside, his breath caught. She was dancing, not the careful, self-conscious swaying they'd shared in the dark sunroom, but real dancing, spinning and twirling around her small room with complete abandon, headphones on, a glass of what looked like orange juice in one hand. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she was wearing jeans and a Howard University t-shirt that made her look young and free and absolutely beautiful. This was Imani in her natural element, unguarded, unself-conscious, completely alive. And he'd almost lost her because he was too afraid to embrace the chaos she brought to his ordered world. Julian knocked on the doorframe, and Imani spun around, her eyes widening when she saw him. She pulled off her headphones, and the music that had been soundtrack to her private dance party spilled into the room. "Julian, Mr. Whitmore, I didn't expect—" "Dance with me," he said. "What?" "Dance with me, please." Imani stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "I don't understand." "I'm a coward," Julian said, stepping into her room uninvited. "You were absolutely right. I'm a coward who spent so long planning for every contingency that I forgot how to take a leap of faith." "Julian, I love you," he said, the words rushing out before he could second-guess them. "I love that you sing while you work and turn my sheets pink and make me laugh at 3 in the morning. I love that you see possibility where I see problems, and that you're brave enough to fight for what you want." Imani's orange juice glass slipped from her fingers, and Julian caught it automatically, setting it safely on her dresser without breaking eye contact. "I love you," he repeated, "and I'm tired of being afraid of what that might mean. I'm tired of letting schedules and obligations and other people's expectations dictate my happiness." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying don't leave. I'm saying stay, not as my employee, but as my partner in making this life less planned and more lived." Julian reached for her hands, and when she didn't pull away, he felt hope unfurl in his chest. "As I'm saying, teach me to dance through the chaos, because I've realized that chaos with you is better than order without you." Imani's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. Does that mean you'll stay?" Instead of answering, Imani reached for her phone and turned up the music. Then she stepped into his arms, and Julian felt like he could breathe properly for the first time in weeks. They danced in her small room, surrounded by half-packed suitcases and sunlight streaming through the windows, and Julian realized this was what happiness felt like. Not the distant satisfaction of achieved goals, but the immediate joy of being exactly where you belonged. "So what happens now?" Imani asked as they swayed together. "Now we figure it out as we go," Julian said, spinning her around and catching her again. "Oh, no plans, no schedules, no predetermined outcomes, just us, making it up as we go along." "That sounds terrifying." "Terrifyingly perfect." As Stevie Wonder's voice filled the room, singing about being signed, sealed, and delivered, Julian kissed Imani and tasted possibility on her lips. Outside, Boston hummed with its usual organized chaos, but inside this small room, 2 people who'd found each other against all odds danced to their own rhythm, creating something beautiful out of the lovely mess of falling in love. And for the first time in his carefully planned life, Julian Whitmore had absolutely no idea what came next. He'd never been happier. The end. Thanks for watching to the end. Did you like the story? Tell us what you thought in the comments below. We want to know what you think. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe now for more exciting stories you won't want to miss. Activate the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. See you in the next story. See you there.